Well, good day, everybody. This is Jim Satterfield at Firestorm. We're glad to have you joining us today. And since it's January and we're in the South, we're going to have snow today. So we decided we wanted to get and match what was going on around the country and join in. And a little while we'll talk to Brenda, and she's over in Alabama, and they're under a snow watch too. So we'll see how it's going to happen. This is part of the Crisis Coach 2018 webinar series that we've been doing with the University of Alabama, I think for about 5 years now as this has been happening, and every month. We're going to be focused today on how to help your organization and make the most of 2018 when we think about crisis and those elements in coming up. We talked last month and reviewed 2017 and went through some of the disasters that we all have seen and experienced, and today it's now what can you do? We are going to focus on that. So let's see if I can get my screen to advance, and there we are. We'd like you to connect with us at Firestorm. We're all over social media. As you can see, the various areas to go and look at. There is a hashtag for today's session, and that is hashtag Crisis Coach. And by the way, we man that hashtag at all times. So if you ever need to get to us quickly, that's a quick way to do it. We have attorneys just like everyone else, and they want a disclaimer saying, hey, it's not complete without the oral comments and discussions. And as we think about any product from Firestorm, you must review it in conjunction with your leadership, your local council, and government authorities where you are. And finally, today is not legal advice or legal opinion. I'm an engineer, and that's probably not a good person to go to and get legal advice. Firestorm transforms crisis into value, and we empower you to manage crisis and risk. And that's been in place since 2005 as we think about Firestorm and what we do. Our expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We're America's crisis coach, and it's that balancing the tension between crisis and risk. And we'll talk about that predict, plan, perform a little bit later. I wanted to give you a quick update. As you may know, if you've been a part of the webinar series over 2017, last January 25th, Firestorm was acquired by Novum, and that gave us access to more resources and capabilities than we had before. And I'm pleased to let you know that on Thursday of last week, we were uplisted onto NASDAQ. And so that's a big deal for us as a company and as an organization as we look where we're going to go and what's going to happen. We also have had 2 acquisitions I just want to give you a heads up about because that increases our capabilities. One of those is SEC, that's not the Securities Exchange Commission, that is the Secure Educations Consultant, and that's a company that specializes in dealing with active shooter workplace violence, the site assessments, our birther program, and the head of that company is a gentleman by the name of Jason Russell. He is our new Chief Security Officer, and he and all of his people are retired Secret Service. So we can start to provide you the same level of security support that the White House gets. And so from the White House to your house certainly is a key element. The other is we acquired BC Management. That's Business Continuity Management. They're a California-based company, and they do the staffing. So our people solutions, whether you need a permanent placement or people to work on an individual project, they also are the leaders in the benchmarking and analytical area. And so we've got a lot of numbers and metrics that we can start to share with you as a result of that, and we will continue to do it. So a great many things are happening at Firestorm, and we're glad that you've taken today to be a part and talk about the goals that we have, that you might have for this year. So as we continue this, we're going to be focusing on the University of Alabama, the College of Continuing Studies, and our thanks go out to them. And we're going to talk particularly today about the Bama at Work program and how your organization can engage directly with them. So Brenda, what do you want to say about all of this, and particularly the upcoming workshop?
Well, good morning. I'm talking to you from my home this morning. The University of Alabama is closed today in preparation for what's thought to be another snowmageddon like we had in 2014, which Jim and I both talked about was a crisis event that a lot of people were unprepared for. So with advanced preparation, hopefully Alabama will fare better this time. And really am excited to share with you about our upcoming workshop. It's our 4th or 5th in the series on professionally speaking. You'll see on the screen 2 of the just most delightful people, professors at the university who are really world-class experts in professionally speaking in crisis communication as well as regular communication. We will have the workshop on campus at the Bryant Conference Center on Friday, February 9th. There is limited seating, and we are ticking up our enrollment. I noticed this morning it's clicking up there. So if you're interested in attending that, please register online, or you can call my office for additional information. And we're just really excited, and it's just another way to hone a person's skill, to add to your repertoire of good skills that's needed no matter what your business world is. So you'll see on the screen our registration number, our website, my email address, and my personal telephone number on campus. So thank you, Jim, for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to a good 2018 and all the good things that we're working on, particularly also, if you'll let me have a minute to highlight our Bertha program that we're in partnership with. Bertha.ua.edu, and we've got a lot of schools already signing up for that. So we're very excited and pleased with our efforts and our own relationship. Thanks so much, Jim.
My pleasure. And the Bertha program is the Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment program that Firestorm and the University of Alabama are rolling out to identify behaviors of concern before they escalate to violence. And the University of Alabama developed an online training program for that, and it is really exceptional, and it would certainly be make a difference. The professionally speaking program has been one that's been a backbone at the University of Alabama for years, and certainly brings out hundreds of people to attend. And in a crisis, and we're going to be talking about that today, the ability to communicate becomes absolutely critical, and it's certainly an excellent opportunity to look at and to understand. So I would encourage that. And I can't leave the University of Alabama slide there without saying Roll Tide. We all watched the national championship and the games there, and we were 100% behind you, Brenda, and you guys came through. And I saw a lot of professional speaking and communications going on during that game from Coach Saban. And there was no doubt that he got his message across to the people that were needed to hear it effectively. I'm not quite sure we're going to use 100% of that in the course that you're teaching, but it certainly would carry those elements associated with it. So we're always proud of the relationship with the University of Alabama. And then I have said on numerous webinars, Roll Tide, and so continue that tide, rolling that tide right along. When we think about crises and disasters, there are a lot of things that come to mind. I saw the movie over the Christmas holidays, The Darkest Hour, and if you have not seen that, I would really recommend that you stop and look at it, and it gives you a clearer focus of what it's like in a crisis. And it related to the first 4 weeks that Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of England, right at the start of World War II. And Neville Chamberlain had just failed in trying to negotiate some settlement with Hitler. There was, the government had to step down. They couldn't find anybody that they could agree to form a government behind. So they selected Winston Churchill, not the Winston Churchill that we all remember from our history classes. They selected Winston Churchill as the compromise candidate. He was the candidate that no one wanted. He was the candidate that was thought that they could control, that would be a Casper milquetoast, a candidate that was seen across England as a complete failure when he'd worked with the government before, and a candidate who had a significant drinking problem, and as a result of that was just not going to be a factor. Obviously, Didn't quite work out the way that the people thought that they were manipulating it. But when you look at this and what he walked into, it really comes around a crisis in making a decision. At the point in time he was appointed prime minister, you had 300,000 British troops trapped at Dunkirk. You got another 4,000 in Calais, two ports in the north of France that the Nazis were about to take out and eliminate and kill them all. The generals had told Winston that no one would survive from that area. He started a program to get private vessels to try to go and get the troops out of Dunkirk. He had to send a telegram to his general in Calais, and imagine the pressure in making this decision. He had to tell that general that it was his responsibility and his 4,000 troops to aggressively engage the enemy to draw them away from Dunkirk so that the other troops could be evacuated, and there would be no evacuation for him, his troops, and no chance for survival. So imagine the pressure of having to make a decision. You're choosing between bad options, and we talk about that a lot in a crisis, where you're literally ordering 4,000 men to their death for the chance to save 300,000. And we talk in a crisis about the difference between making a good, you're choosing between a bad choice and a bad choice. Which do you want to do as you go through it? So in looking at that, and I'll talk some more about Winston a little bit later, but he was a master with words, and when they thought they had him in a box and tricked, he came back and held the day and got the support from the people in Britain. And one politician turned to another and said, "How did we lose? We had him in a box." And the comment was, Winston brought words to war. And the way he talked about it in the finest hour, and when I did a little research before our webinar series this month, and he used the finest hour in 18 different speeches at different times. And one of them, he was in the bomb shelters as the bombs were dropping on England and telling them that this would be seen as their finest hour for years to come and generations to come. But I pulled this quote because I think it relates to what you do in your job and what we do in our job every day. I'm going to read the quote, and then I want to frame it as we start to talk about what you can do this year in your company, in your organization, in your school to make a difference. To each there comes in their lifetime a special moment when they are figuratively tapped on the shoulder and offered the chance to do a very special thing, unique to them and fitted to their talents. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which could have been their finest hour. You are in this webinar series because you have responsibility in your organization around business continuity or safety or security or IT disaster recovery, making sure that people are prepared and ready to make those decisions to go, because you're going to be needed at what will be your organization's finest hour in that focus. So our goal today in our webinar is to talk about what you can do this year within your organization. And I'm going to give you some things to think about, and hopefully we'll pull that together as we talk about it, because the concept of being unprepared or unqualified at that moment in time when you have to make those decisions. And remember, you're going to be making those decisions based upon inaccurate, incomplete information at a time that it's going to become crucial for everyone that's there. So I want you to think about the first person that needs to be involved in whatever is going on, the crisis, the emergency, the disaster, the event. I want you to think about the first hour that's going to go on and what needs to be done. And then I want to talk about the finest hour. And then I'm going to tell you some things at Firestorm, and I'd like you to draw the conclusions back to your organization and what you need to do this year. So that's the framing of our conversation today. Now, we talk about the first person perspective. When some story comes up, that first person point of view becomes extremely important. We've certainly seen many things with terrorist events and shooting events during the year. We had the hurricanes. There was over $300 billion worth of damage just out of the hurricanes on U.S. soil this year. There has to be this first-person perspective. The mudslides in California, those events are coming down. So I want you to think about what is the perspective from that first person and insight into the events around them. So I'd like you to stop and think in your organization, who is that first person that you want to reach out to? But what are we going to be looking for? Now, in a crisis, as we've said every time, that it's not business as usual, it's business as unusual. Again, most of what you learn is going to be wrong. It's going to be incomplete. And you're going to choose between things that are not good decisions that are going to have to be there. So what is it that you want that first person to do? And you see in the circle there, they're going to have to decide, do, and say something. Comes back to the professionally speaking that Brenda talked about, but being able to communicate at this point will become absolutely critical. And the first person about the crisis has a specific set of responsibilities. What do you want that first person to do? What notification are they going to have to send out? What actions do you want to have them take? Are we sheltering in place? Are we evacuating? Are we doing a lockout or a lockdown? How do we get those done in a variety of different areas to consider? So think about this first person and who that is in each particular area. So if you think about your organization in the crisis, who is the first person that you look to? I will tell you that your organization looks to you, or you wouldn't be on our webinar today. You have a job responsibility in this area. You've got a responsibility, and the pressure is on you to make sure those things are in place and are set. I would ask you, who is the first person that you would look at for each types of the vulnerabilities and threats and risks that you're exposed to? So identifying those, identifying what their impacts are, how you're going to monitor them, what's going to trigger your plan and actions, and what are you going to communicate. We had driven home to all of us over the weekend the alert that went out in Hawaii. Imagine that. The notice that ballistic missiles are headed to you, seek shelter. This is not a drill, it's an actual event. Look at the fact that it took them 38 minutes to retract that. And we saw families putting children in sewers to try to protect them. We saw people running and making a phone call to tell a loved one goodbye. Imagine the implications of that. And it came down to one man's decision who pushed the wrong button at the wrong time because he thought it was a test. And it turned out to send that message out. But once they recognized it, it took them 38 minutes to figure out, what do we do? Think about the planning aspect that was missed here. No one had considered that someone could send a message out that was wrong and how they would retract it and what they would need to do at that point in time. What channel did it go out over? How did they respond back? I mean, a senator sent a tweet out that this was not real, but thinking about that, and what is it going to mean the next time and it is real in getting those messages out? So if you don't focus on this first person and what to do if it's wrong, because remember, we've said that repeatedly, that's the position we're going to find ourselves in. So my first challenge for you today is to think about, in all of the crisis and vulnerability and risk and threat areas, who is the first person that you look to in each area? And what is it that you look for them to do and say in the decisions that they're going to have to make? And it's more than just knowing that. We have to get more specific and think about that first hour. What are the decisions you make? What are the actions you take? And what are the words that you say? We could summarize that big binder that you've got and all the plans put into place to come back to, let's focus on the decisions, let's focus on the actions, and let's focus on the words. You see how this starts to build one over the other through each point along the way. when we think about 2018, and nobody knows what will happen this year and what the events are, but we had predicted that we would see terrorists moving onto U.S. soil. That prediction hasn't changed, and it continues to happen. And unfortunately, we know there'll be another hurricane season. We've certainly seen the results of the wildfires in California, and then the fact that you've lost that coverage, and now the flooding and mudslides and the number of deaths and missing people and the disruption. No one wants to see a Category 7 or 8 earthquake in California. No one wants to experience #MeToo within their school or their business. But think about the uncertainty that's there. And it comes down to the decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say. Now, we always look at how you do in a crisis and how do you know if it is your finest hour. What you see up on the screen is the Firestorm maturity model for crisis management. I wanted to point it out, and I would encourage you to use this if you're doing an exercise or you find yourself in a crisis, to be able to understand what we did. Now, the dimensions along that left-hand column, the decision process, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision-making, and communications effectiveness are going to go a long way to determine, did we have the outcome in this event that we really wanted and needed to have. Now, we measure it in a maturity model along 4 stages, coming from a stage 1 where everything is a surprise and there's liability, all the way up to a stage 4 where it's strategic. As you're able to move from one stage to the other, there's a breakthrough. If you can get up to stage 2, then that's a control breakthrough. You're in much more control. If you get to stage 3 where it's supportive and pre-action, then everything is aligned to get you to that point. And then finally, if it's integrated, if it's strategic, if it's part of the culture of who you are, that's the value breakthrough. And there's a value here in how you handle crisis. And if you remember at the very beginning of our webinar today, we talked about how do we transform crisis into value. And you're now starting to see that. So take this and use it in your organization and do that evaluation. Now, if you're rating in each one of those 5 dimensions, you might be a 2 at one and a 3 at another, and maybe in one of those you're a 4. But let's assume that your speed of decision making was at a stage 1 level. The descriptor there is slow process, events outpace leaders, serious confusion consumes the executive team within your organization. That means your overall response goes down to a 1. Because if you make the right decision but make it too late, it doesn't matter. And so if you look at it, you're always going to be measured by your lowest rating associated with it. And that's going to be understanding your finest hour. So we're going to shift the conversation now to talk about helping your first person. And so what we want to do is to think about that before, during, and after a crisis. And so there are things that you can do at each one of those things. There's stuff that you'd be doing today, like sitting in the webinar and listening to the thoughts that we have around these things and better understanding each of those components. And then during, to support those decisions, and then recovering after to mitigate the environments. So I'm going to share with you how Firestorm views this and how we do it internally. And then you need to extrapolate that to your organization and what you have in place. You may have many of the things that we're going to talk about already there. And if so, I'm excited. That's great. And that's the reason we spend so much time and talk about each one of these things. And those that you don't, you should start to think about adding. So as we start to think about before, during, and after, we look at all of our solutions and we view it from an end-to-end standpoint. We've got to cover this at every step along the way. We talked about the football game from last week and Alabama winning the national championship. They just didn't show up on that field on that night saying, what do you guys want to do? Let's just go do something. There was a plan, there was a rationale, there was a reason. When things didn't work the right way, they made a change in quarterback. They put in a freshman who'd not played in the game, a freshman who had not had any game experience in the championship game down at the half to go in and change it. Because if they had continued where they were, the coach said, we're not going to have the outcome that we need. And we want everyone to have a successful outcome. So when we break it down, we see 6 different verticals that you need to put in place within your organization. I'm going to talk about them quickly, and then I'm going to go through each one, and I think it will point you into things that you need to start to consider to look at. First are the crisis and risk solutions. Those are the crisis management, the identification of the risks that are associated with it. Even insurance plays a role there within it. So what have you done looking at crisis and risk solutions within your organizations? People solutions. Do you have the right people? Are they trained? Do they have the right skill sets to do at each point along the way? Have you integrated them together to be able to make sure it's going to work seamlessly? Security. Now, we talk a lot about business continuity and we talk a lot about other things, but with 2 million episodes of workplace violence annually in the United States, you've got to make sure your security solutions integrate directly with your resiliency and your continuity plans, directly with everything that you're looking for. So having the assessments done, identifying the behaviors of concern, training for active shooter, even certification around it. Security is going to play a much greater role than historically when we've talked about these areas. Then professional services. Congratulations, you're in charge of professional services within your organization. You wouldn't be on the webinar today if you didn't have that responsibility. That's making sure that you've got the right plans in place, making sure that people are trained on the plans, knowing that they've been tested, knowing how that those decisions get made in a crisis and that there's been training and testing of that to those elements are done. There's a target for every plan. There are responsibilities that you want employees or students to know if there's an event that's going on. There's an incident emergency response. What do you want your team to do to help facilitate the actions that need to be taken? How do they make decisions in the crises with your senior leadership? How you recover for that with departmental recovery plans or IT disaster recovery plans. That is your element because you're in charge of those professional services within your organization. Intelligence solutions, identifying what's going on, looking at both predictive, protective intelligence. There's information out on the internet that's open source, looking at those solutions, identifying the behaviors of concerns. We're seeing today in America, if someone has ill intent, somebody else knows, and if they know, what do? They talk about it. And where do people talk about it? They talk about it on the internet. So how are you using intelligence within your responsibilities to make the decisions and know now is the time? And finally, analytical solutions. How do your plans match up? How do you compare to standards and best practices? The new Firestorm Acquisition BC Management runs 6 different programs through the year that you can see this is where we are relative to someone else. I'm going to go through those 6 again, but I'd encourage you to now stop and think about 2018 and your department, your job, and what you're doing in each one of those. I'm going to hit these 6 areas fairly quickly. So under crisis and risk solutions, predict, plan, perform. What are the vulnerabilities and threats? What are their impacts? How do you measure them? What tools do you use? What are the triggers that would activate your plans? What decisions would you have to make if that's happening? What actions would you have to take? And then finally, what words would you say as you perform in those areas? That's at the fundamental level. So when we look and think about crisis and risk solutions, you see down at the bottom of this page, we're thinking about emergency response. How do your plans align to others? How do you manage this incident? How do you coordinate and interface with first responders? The crisis management and making the decisions within your organization. Looking at the crisis index, that's where we're measuring the outrage, the fault, the fear that's involved. And the events that we saw happen in Hawaii are a good example about seeing how that was responding. Look at those people if they thought and they did for 38 minutes, that it was not a matter of if that missile was going to land, it was going to land on them in the process that you would see. We provide 24/7 real-time response. We have a crisis operations center that's staffed and ready to respond. We do that 6 times a day. How are you handling that within your organization? How are you doing it? We use the term crisis coach. It's a registered mark, but I think your job within your organization is to be that coach within the organization. How do you help people be better to make those types of decisions that need to be done? The training, what programs do you have in place? That goes to, are your people ready? How do you know, and are you sure? Exercises, and then crisis stop. Crisis stop talks about that first hour where you stabilize the events, that's the S. T, trigger the resources that you need. Opine on what the consequences are, and the P is prevent the common crisis mistakes. Think about your job and what you're doing with crisis and risk solutions. Then you got to have people solutions. Do you have enough people? Do you have the right staff? Are you a one-man shop within your organization? Do you need temporary people that you can call in, or even interim staffing within projects? Firestorm, for example, has an expert council with 130 nationally recognized experts. Who are you going to call when you need those helps? The coaching, external consulting is a way to augment your department. You may not have but you or 2 or 3 others in your company. How do you continue to expand that? You can even get virtual staffing now with the internet and having access to phones and the systems. For example, we can supply you with a virtual chief security officer or a virtual chief information security officer, having that type of help. And then if you look at what University of Alabama has done through the years, it's that next line there, helping your people grow. What are you doing? What are your plans within your organization this year to help your people grow? Mentoring, it's an area that we haven't talked a lot about in other webinars, but who's mentoring your folks? Are you doing that? Who's mentoring you? How do we get all of us together to help each other? And the word training. If we move beyond people solutions, it's security solutions. And I said at the very beginning, we see this as the biggest shift. And certainly all of the work that we've done over the years from our crisis management at Virginia Tech, over 10 years ago, it'll be 11 years this coming April. If you look at that, we've seen those impacts, and that's where the behavioral risk threat assessment program came from, to identify it. Do you need a virtual chief security officer? Who is the chief security officer within your organization? Have you had security consulting, someone looking at it? One of the things that we're starting to do now is design security into construction and working with the architects as you're building a new building or you're expanding the campus that you have. What needs to be put into place? The training for your people, certifying them that they know what to do. Clearly looking at active shooter and violence, having an assessment, looking not only at the 5 components that are required, but where you are relative to it, relative to your exposures. A site assessment, cybersecurity, and businesses are increasingly being targeted at those threats. The behavioral risk threat assessment program, that's the BERTHA that we talked about, looking at threat assessments in individual cases. We're talking with a government agency in the mid-Atlantic area, and they had done 3 assessments during the year on individual employees, and they had one they were unclear about how serious is this and what do they need to do, and having that difference. And so looking at the facilities and how they're designed, whether it's a school or a business, you're going to see security become an increasing factor for you in 2018. Professional services, that's what you're doing every day in your job. You're assessing what your needs are, you're figuring out how you're going to address those, and then you're acting as you need to. Critical decision support, how do you get that into your organization? What assets do you need in order to make those? Developing a plan that's customized for your organization, getting a template or something off the internet and Customizing it for your organization may fit your budget, but taking a template that works in one location may or may not fit what you're looking for. Looking at how you're responding to the crisis and managing those, the training, conducting exercises. That's when you find out that plans don't work. When you open them up and somebody goes, well, I don't know where to go. I don't know what to look at within my documents. There's that crisis communications coming up again with the professionally speaking. Being able to speak at a time when you're under duress, looking at assessments, tools, and templates. What are you doing in your organization in these areas? Intelligence solutions, predictive, protective, and preventative. One of the things when we go look back at all of the events that are occurring, it could easily be seen that. What's the risk profile that you're concerned about? If a threat occurs, what's the workflow? Who's going to get that information? What do they have to decide? What are they looking at? What's the language, the semantics, the context, the syntax of going on? As we're analyzing postings in open source intelligence areas, what does that lead us to? And looking, one of the first things in a crisis that we're focused on is looking and seeing what's out in social media. What does that mean to us and where we're going? Think about the events again in Hawaii over the weekend, where the announcement was made that a ballistic missile is going to strike us and you must take shelter now. Looking at those communications, how, if there's an escalation, how do you map it? Who's going to then say and get involved? And then doing the analysis after the event, doing a hot wash. What lessons learned are here? What worked well? What is it that we need to change? Now, analytical solutions. Great, I got a plan. How do I compare to somebody else? Benchmarking that plan through versus standards and best practices, others in my industry group and section, comparing programs, sharing. If we've got a good way to do it and you've got a good way to do something else, maybe we can share those back and forth and look at the industry and areas that we're doing. Program management, summaries, compensation, analysis. Are you paying your people the right level? How do you compare to others within your industry in those areas? What are the diagnostics in looking at it? We think about automobiles today. There's computer systems built in that can tell you that where the problem is and what needs to be done. We've developed diagnostic tools so that we can identify where are the data points in your plans that you need to focus on. What are the metrics that you're going to use to decide if you're doing a good job or not? Back when we were in schools, the metrics were fairly clear. They gave a test and we got a number, and that there was a grade that went along with it. The same thing applies with our plans, and I would encourage you to look at yours, then the benchmarking those, and then competitive analysis. Is your competitor doing something better than you, and should think about each of those things and what you would do. So as we kind of bring this back together, what's your methodology? What are you looking at what are you doing this year to be more innovative in these areas? Now, we talk a lot about communications, and there are 3 types of specific communications in a crisis. Go back and look at the vulnerabilities and threats that you've identified and look at what you're doing in each one of these communications areas. The first communication is coordination. That's where you're going to be communicating and telling people what you need to have them do. And we saw the failure again in Hawaii on that program. No one ever contemplated that we could send the wrong message out at the wrong time. How do we correct it? How do we put that in place? You look at your program today and say, do we use one of the tools that's in the marketplace? And if so, who's got the message? Who has the control of it? And how do we know that that right one has gone out? You're going to get pressure to talk about the brand and reputation impacts on that crisis. We will tell you that that form of communications can wait 24 hours. The coordination has to be now, but the brand and reputation communication, that can wait until tomorrow. We're not going to go out, and if you remember, most everything you know initially is wrong or incomplete, and you do not want to put your president, your executive director out as that person who's giving that initial communication. If we destroy their credibility, it will be very difficult to recover. And then finally, compliance. You are, in many cases, required to report certain things. A cyber breach, for example, you have to tell the people whose identity that's been stolen. If you're in a school today, you have responsibilities if you think that a child is at risk, that you must talk with the police or Child and Family Services. So look at those communications, planning them out. All three of these could be mapped out in advance, so you'd have home bases and message maps for every threat and risk that you've identified. If you don't have that, somebody's going to have to make it up on a fly in the middle of a crisis or a disaster. So we followed the predict, plan, perform. You need to figure out the methodology that works best for you, but I think that's a good way to at least start to frame this. What are the vulnerabilities and threats? What are their impacts? How do we monitor them? What are the triggers? How do we activate our plans? What is it that we expect people to decide? What is it that we expect people to do? And what is it that we expect people to say? So if you think about that, that will give you a head start and make that planning process significantly easier. But it's not enough just to have done the prediction or to have done the plan. You've got to train everyone. You have to test it. And then you have to perform when it's really going to matter. Now, I showed you the quote from Winston Churchill earlier in today's session. But if you can't think about that last sentence, then you're going to be at a disadvantage this year. What a tragedy if that moment finds them unprepared or unqualified for that which could have been their finest hour. That's a call to action for all of us for 2018. What are you doing to make sure that your people are prepared, that they have the emergency supplies, that they have the right plans in place, and it's been tested and trained? And unqualified, you probably know in your organization that there's some people that are going to do a better job than others. We've also seen that in many of these crises and events, 80% of the people freeze and don't act. So who's leading it, who's directing it, and who's changing it will make a difference, because all of this is about helping them to achieve their finest hour. Now, what's next? We've covered a lot of information. There will be a brief around today's webinar. You can go to firestorm.com and download that. There'll also be a recording of it if you want to share our discussion today with someone else in your organization. You have questions and you want to say, well, wait a minute, I want to better understand the benchmarking or the virtual staffing or some other aspect. You can contact us at webinars@firestorm.com. We'll even do a benchmark assessment of your plans, comparing it to standards and best practices, and we'll waive the fee. We're that committed and that concerned that you're not ready to be at that point. We'll also support you with our Crisis Stop program. That means that you can call us in the first hour of the crisis, and there's no charge to you or your organization as we help you stabilize the events, trigger the resources, opine on the consequences, and prevent the common mistakes. That's part of our commitment to you and part of our commitment through the University of Alabama. And then finally, you can register for next month's webinar series and carry that forward. So I would be remiss if I didn't stop to thank the University of Alabama for all that they've done. Brenda, anything you want to add to our conversation today?
The only thing I wanted to add was you had no idea that Winston Churchill is my absolute favorite, and that I also saw the movie during the holiday and followed up with Dunkirk and then The Post. And all of those have great decision-making moments, highlights, and just dovetails so nicely into your presentation today, and what a great job. And I always learn something, and I was making notes myself, and I really think it's a good call to action for 2018 for all of us to make our plans, what we need to do, what we need to improve on, and to get a plan to get there. So thanks so much for all you're doing. I'm excited about Bertha and our professionally speaking workshop, and looking forward to a great 2018.
Thanks, Brenda, and thanks to the University of Alabama. When you think back about Winston Churchill, and you ask his peers at that time, they would have said he was unqualified. They would have said he was unfit. They would have said he was unprepared. But at the time he was needed most, he made decisions. He took actions. And he said the words that moved the minds of those around. His critics said that he brought words to war. I will tell you that in every one of the things that we're preparing about, every one of the things that we're thinking about, words are going to matter. But more importantly, thinking this through and getting the help that you need for your leadership and your people become critical. If you've got questions, you can go to firestorm.com and download briefs and articles and access other training. You can join us send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com and ask us questions, and we'll get you answers. You can call us at 800-321-2219. If you find yourself in a crisis and you call us on that line, identify it in the very first moments in the call. I'm calling for a crisis stop. I'm in a crisis. The routing of that so that we can have you started on the path to what you need to make a difference. Because those decisions you make, those actions you take, and those words that you say in the first hour will determine is this going to stabilize or escalate. Thank you again for all that you do within your company. Hopefully we gave you some new thoughts to think about for the year. I look forward to speaking with you again. And so until next month, have a great 2018. Goodbye.